नमस्ते, मेरा नाम कविता पटेल है। मैं बीए सेकेंड ईयर की स्टूडेंट हूँ। मोबाइल ने हमारी लाइफ को चेंज करके रख दिया। हमने अपना सिलेबस भी मोबाइल इंटरनेट से मंगा के देखा और समझा सेकेंड ईयर का। और कोई भी टॉपिक अगर हमको नहीं समझ आता था तो हम लोग यूट्यूब पे जा कर के उस टॉपिक को समझते थे। और क्योंकि सर थे नहीं, कॉलेज बंद हो चुका था कोरोना के दौरान, तो मोबाइल ही हम लोगों की बहुत मदद किया। मोबाइल से हमने बहुत सारी स्किल्स को एक्सप्लोर किया, जैसे कि वीडियो एडिटिंग करना, वॉइस एडिटिंग करना, वीडियो मेकिंग करना। हमने बहुत सारे नए नए डिज़ाइंस बनाने सीखे, जैसे कि ऐप्स के माध्यम से, जैसे कैनवा एक ऐप है। और जैसे कि और हमको ये सब चीज़ें हम अपने गांव में भी वुमेंस को इंस्पायर करने के लिए करते थे। जैसे कि कोई अलग चीज़ बतानी है, जैसे कि पीरियड के विषय में बताना है तो समझाना है, तो हम नहीं अगर बेहतर तरीके से समझा पाते तो कोई वीडियो सर्च करके हम लोगों को बताते हैं और दिखा देते हैं कि देखिए ऐसा ऐसा है, वो लोग समझ जाती हैं। तो इसका इम्पैक्ट तो बहुत ही बड़ा है और इतना पावर है मोबाइल में कि पूरी दुनिया को बदल सकते हैं, दुनिया से कनेक्ट कर सकते हैं। दुनिया मुट्ठी में है अगर आपके पास मोबाइल है तो।
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. My name is Isabel. I'm the Insights Director for Digital Inclusion at GSMA. Today we have an exciting webinar focused on tackling social norms to reduce the gender digital divide. I'll be sharing with you some of the highlights from our India data from our recent Mobile Gender Gap report. And we have a great range of speakers from both GSMA and BBC Media Action. Next slide, please. Our speakers from BBC Media Action will be showcasing some new and innovative research in India, and then we'll follow that with a fireside chat to explore some more of the research. Please do feel free to use the chat to put in your questions. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, and we'll try to get all your questions answered. Next slide, please. GSMA publishes a report on the mobile gender gap in low and middle income countries every year to try and size the gender gap in mobile ownership and mobile internet use. This is done through face-to-face, nationally representative surveys, and our findings in India showed that in 2021, women were 14% less likely than men in India to own a phone, and they were 41% less likely to use the mobile internet. Next slide, please. But let's look at the trends. Since 2019, both men and women's ownership of mobile has continued to grow, and the gender gap has reduced somewhat since then. But with women still 14% less likely to own a mobile phone than men, the gap still persists. Next slide, please. The type of mobile device a person owns has a major impact on how and whether they use the mobile internet. Although it's possible to use the internet on a feature phone, which is the middle section of these bars here, internet use on a smartphone is typically richer, more regular and varied. As you can see in the lighter shaded section, a quarter of women in India now own a smartphone, but for men, it's almost half of the population. Next slide, please. But before someone can actually use the internet, they actually need to know that it exists. And as you can see here, only half of women in India are aware of the mobile internet, compared to 70% of men. And there's been very little change in these levels since 2019. This low awareness is a key contributor to the gender gap in mobile internet use. Next slide, please. Strong progress has been made in India in reducing the mobile gender gap since 2019. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, more women came online than men, which narrowed the gender gap quite substantially from 50% down to 33%. During that time, there were more socially acceptable use cases for women, justifying their use of mobile internet. For example, the need to just get on with life virtually, access their children's education online, or communicate via video calls with friends and family during those times of social distancing. But in 2021, there was no notable change in the proportion of women starting to use mobile internet in India. So you can see it stayed flat at 30% again in 2021, whilst men's use continued to increase, resulting in a widening of the gender gap up to 41%. The gender gap is particularly acute for certain groups of women, including those with low literacy levels, who live in rural areas, who are unemployed or have low income, who are over the age of 55, or for those living with a disability. Next slide, please. Let's look now at why women don't own a mobile. The three most commonly reported barriers to ownership amongst women in India were, firstly, handset cost, difficulties with reading and writing, and not knowing how to use a mobile. We know that there are also structural barriers and social norms that can prevent women in India from owning a mobile phone. And 13% of women who don't own a mobile reported that this was due to a lack of family approval. Next slide, please. When it comes to using the internet, amongst women who are mobile users and they are aware of the internet, the most commonly reported barriers reported to us were, firstly, data costs, even though across lower middle income countries, India has some of the lowest cost data packages. Then there was difficulties with reading and writing, and handset costs also came in the top three, and that's the cost of an internet-enabled handset. Next slide, please. Finally, we also looked at women's autonomy when it comes to purchasing a mobile phone. And among adults who got a new device in the past year in India, we found that women were not only less likely to have paid for the device themselves, but they were also less likely to have chosen the model themselves. And finally, even when they did pay for the device themselves, they were still less likely than men to have had autonomy over the choice of which mobile they got. This highlights the pervasive social norms that can restrict women's access and use of mobile and the mobile internet. If you'd like to find out more about our mobile gender gap, please do download our mobile gender gap report, which also includes a special spotlight on India this year. And with that, I will hand over to Sarah Chamberlain from BBC Media Action. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Isabel, to the gender gap in India. In India, in collaboration with two of our partners, Chaitanya Wise and Pradhan, we have been exploring how to accelerate women's digital adoption in self-help groups in the state of Madhya Pradesh. More than 82 million women in India are members of self-help groups, so the scale of the opportunity is significant. This work has been undertaken as part of the Digital Women's Economic Empowerment Project, a 3-year research, learning, and design grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to identify if and how digital technology can accelerate and enhance pathways to women's economic empowerment in collectives without making existing inequalities worse. Next slide, please. When designing digital solutions in contexts where there is a significant gender digital divide, it's critical to adopt a gender intentional approach. Melinda French Gates has defined gender intentionality as identifying and understanding gender inequalities, gender-based constraints, and inequitable norms and dynamics, and taking steps to address them. So why does gender intentional design matter? To quote Melinda French Gates again, development projects that ignore gender inequalities usually fail to meet their objectives. USAID concurs that programs that incorrectly assume that their users or beneficiaries have the required digital skills may set themselves up to fail or deepen the divide between the digital haves and have-nots. The figure on this slide depicts the 5-stage human-centered design process that was first pioneered by the design school at Stanford University. In India, we have adopted and adapted this methodology for over a decade, applying a gender lens to create, for example, one of the largest mobile health communication programs in the world, which we transitioned to the government of India in 2019 after scaling to 10 million women and 300,000 frontline health workers. You can read about how we did this in an article published in a special supplement in BMJ Global Health. We've spent the last 12 months using this same methodology to design and test approaches to reducing the gender digital divide in India. In step 1, we conducted research to understand digital gender inequalities, gender-based constraints, and inequitable norms. In step 2, we analyzed the results of the research to better understand the barriers to women's digital adoption and to create our theory of change. In step 3, we worked from our theory of change to generate ideas. In step 4, we created prototypes, including of the implementation model. In step 5, we rolled the intervention out to more than 1,000 women in self-help groups while iteratively testing it. After each test, we modified and optimized every aspect of the intervention. Next slide, please. We're now going to share our findings from each stage of this journey, beginning with the discover step. Next slide, please. We began by conducting 3 landscaping studies. Our first study investigated the scale and characteristics of the divide in India, particularly on social media, where only 30% of YouTube users and 24% of Facebook users were women in February 2022. We also explored the causes of the divide. Our second study explored why most digital literacy interventions in India haven't reduced the divide at scale yet, and which approaches showed the most promise. We found that most interventions focused on skills training without addressing the gap in women's access to phones. So after receiving training, women had no opportunities to practice. We also found training programs were often gender blind, i.e. they ignored gender-based constraints and inequitable norms and dynamics. We found that few had documented theories of change, and most hadn't defined the ultimate goal of the project, i.e. digital literacy. It's key to note that definitions of digital literacy have moved on from a narrow focus on skills development to definitions that encompass safely using mobile phones for purposes that women and men consider meaningful in their lives and society. So it's no longer about tech for tech's sake, it's about what you can do with it. Our landscaping study also identified a significant gap in the evidence of impact of digital literacy programs, perhaps because of a lack of standardized metrics and research questions for measuring digital access, ownership, skill, and use, and a lack of investment in robust independent evaluations. And finally, we studied different types of women's collectives, including self-help groups, cooperatives, and micro-enterprises, to understand the relationship between women's social network expansion and growing empowerment in collectives and their use of digital technologies. Next slide, please. In the second stage of the project, we analyzed the results of all of this research to understand the barriers to women's digital adoption better and to define our theory of change. Cost is undoubtedly one of the biggest barriers, i.e., as Isabel said, women can't afford devices and ongoing talk time and data. But given the scale of the gender digital divide in India, we have to ask ourselves, too expensive for whom? In other words, why are smartphones and data less affordable for women than men? A common assumption is that the access challenge can be overcome by giving women devices and SIM cards or subsidizing talk time and data. But there's compelling evidence that when programs procure and distribute devices and SIM cards to women, they rapidly find their way into the hands of male family members who either appropriate or monopolize them. So if women's low levels of access to digital technologies isn't about cost, or isn't just about cost, what's going on here? Many research studies, including the GSMA Mobile Gender Gap Report that we just heard about, indicate that a lack of education is preventing women from using mobile phones. And yes, it stands to reason that despite advances in voice technology, women's use of smartphones and the internet will be lower in countries with high levels of female illiteracy. But one has to ask again, Why are so many more women than men illiterate? Next slide, please. Like others before us, including Inclusion Economics at Yale, IT for Change in India, IT Research Africa, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Cape Town, to name but a few, our research has identified that if you dig into the cost and education barriers, you'll find powerful social norms at work. Next slide. Most of the normative barriers on this slide were identified by the GSMA. One slide back, please, Mac. And can be found in their excellent report, Triggering Mobile Internet Use Among Men and Women in South Asia. In the last 6 months, we've conducted more than 300 in-depth interviews to understand these barriers better. We've spoken to women who do not own phones in self-help groups, their husbands, as well as their digital allies at home and in the community, and women who we identified as early adopters of technology in self-help groups. I'll share some highlights from our findings now, focusing on just a few of the significant barriers. I'll start with perceived lack of need or relevance. When interviewed, women who don't own phones often say, "I don't need a mobile phone. What would I do with it?" Their husbands say the same thing. To quote one respondent, "What would my wife do with a smartphone? She just sits at home." However, men report that their own mobile phones are vital tools for work and communication. They also report purchasing smartphones and paying data costs for daughters who are getting good grades in high school or have made it into college. They talk about their job prospects. There seems to be a powerful link between women's low levels of labor force participation in India and men being unwilling to invest in expensive smartphones for women and data. In other words, it doesn't make economic sense. The second normative barrier I'd like to discuss is lack of time. Women report not having time to learn how to use mobile phones. But when we probed this barrier, we found that husbands of women who don't own phones think mobiles are a waste of time for women. To quote one respondent, "If my wife gets a smartphone, she will just pester me to buy things and neglect the housework. The bread will burn." Women who don't own mobile phones have internalized these attitudes. They aren't aware that mobile phones could save them a huge amount of time and effort, just as they already do for their husbands. Another key barrier is low self-confidence. When interviewed, women say, "I can't learn how to use mobile phones. I'm not educated, and it just goes in one ear and out the other." Their husbands report the same thing. "My wife can't read and write. How will she learn?" Husbands also express concern that their wives will break their smartphones. Women have internalized these attitudes, and when probed, talk with fear about making mistakes on their husbands' mobiles, including accidentally deleting important content or dialing their husband's work contacts by mistake. They also say they have no one to learn from at home, but many admit that they've never asked because, quote, "I'm afraid they'll say no." Another critical barrier that we probed is fear of the negative side of the internet, and linked to that, limited mobility. 3 key concerns have emerged. Firstly, the internet has become synonymous with social media, and social media is considered inappropriate for respectable women and girls. Husbands report that women who use smartphones and the internet will get spoiled or ruined, and women report having received nasty comments from strange men online and unsolicited calls. Those men who allow their wives or sisters to use social media tightly control access. Secondly, our research identified that the social norms that limit women's mobility offline have been extended online to create a sort of digital purdah. As Ritu Pant from our partner Chaitanya Wise recently summarized, just as it's not considered respectable for women and girls to spend too much time hanging out in public spaces, such as the marketplace, it's also not acceptable for them to hang out online, which is, after all, a global public space. Both of these key concerns seem to boil down to men's fears about women using ICTs to interact with others, a barrier that is found not just in India, but around the world. And women have internalized these fears, even when it comes to basic phones. When probed about why they have never pressed the green button, many women admit that they are afraid a stranger might be calling. None of the women we interviewed reported having dialed a free helpline number except to call an ambulance. They said only men dial helplines. Next slide, please. The results of our digital literacy landscaping study underline that increasing women's digital literacy is not a simple linear process. There are several conditions that need to be in place, and they need to be in place in tandem. In a way, creating the perfect conditions for women's digital adoption is akin to a complex jigsaw puzzle. The most promising approaches we've identified in India involve group learning and social support within a female-led environment outside the home, which leverages women's trusted social networks, i.e. the collective. We found that interventions that directly target women as individuals were less successful. Continuous and regular access to appropriate technology for learning and practice in socially acceptable spaces near women's homes, i.e. not in training centers in the market, but in each other's houses, which is where SHG meetings take place. Appealing digital use cases that motivate women to learn, but also have support from digital gatekeepers. These use cases need to establish, not just for men, but fundamentally for women, the value of proposition of mobile use and ownership. And critically, interventions that engage male gatekeepers to change their attitudes towards women's use of information communication technology. I'd like to now hand over to Kalpana Pant, Executive Director of our partner Chaitanya Wise, to talk about why self-help groups hold such promise as a platform for women's empowerment.
Thanks, Sarah. I think very clearly elaborated the various gender barriers to use of digital technology. And when we were discussing these barriers, one of the ways in which we could address some of these challenges was looking at the self-help group and federation model, the women's collectives that have a huge outreach now in the country. And Chaitanya has been one of the pioneers in bringing women together at the village level through self-help groups and village organizations, and then collectively coming together 2,500 to 3,000 women in a federation and engaging in access to finance, and along with that, a number of discussions that happen through these collectives. Very importantly, just I want to highlight how these collectives are addressing 4 stages of women's empowerment, which starts with a desire for change, which means coming up with the need to, okay, I want to own a mobile. Because initially, what is the use of such a mobile is also the thought in the minds of women. I don't need it. Men and my children can make use of it better. Then the means for change, which is how to use mobile, which a lot of different government programs, as has been shared by Sarah in the literature review, the focus has been on trainings and more or less have not yielded much result. But how continuous trainings would be possible only when they are part of a collective, uh, a, a self-help group meeting where it is a trusted social network. They know each other, they understand each other, and they can learn from each other because it's a safe space for them to learn. And it's not just one way learning where somebody is imparting knowledge or information to you, but they're learning from each other. And when they're learning from each other, they have a role model, a leader. We call them jankars, or the community resource person, somebody who's smart from within the community, who has learned how to use the mobile a little bit, and then is imparting this knowledge in a very informal kind of a setting or a network to other women. So they look up to her, they can approach her very easily, and it's not like a one time event, which by and large a lot of digital learning programs in the country have been focusing on one digital literacy mission program. and that's the end of it. But it's more a sustained kind of continuous learning environment which they are getting through the self-help group and federation platform. Most importantly, our federations are providing access to finance for women. So, women are engaged in savings. They also take loans from within the groups. These are small ticket size loans, and they can also avail big loans from the federations as well as the banks to start any small enterprise. And therefore, once they learn, the desire is there, the means, in fact, the knowledge is there. That is when the action comes uh, in terms of access to loan to purchase a mobile, which can happen very easily in a self-help group setting. And then the last part of it, that they start using the mobile, and the use of mobile gets gradually accepted in the community and within the society. So this sustained engagement, which helps women go through the four cycles of desire for change, means, action, and acceptance, this has been possible in the design through the self-help group women's collective network. Thanks, Sarah. Back to you.
Thanks, Kalpana. I was struggling to get myself off mute there. Thank you so much. And it's important to say that our design experiments in Madhya Pradesh have not managed to address all of these puzzle pieces, or at least not all of them equally. In some cases, this is because others are already doing excellent work in this space. For example, online fraud is a growing challenge around the world, and sadly, women in SHGs in India are also being targeted. We interviewed women who reported that their bank accounts had been emptied of all their savings through telephone scams. The government has been making a concerted effort to educate citizens and tackle fraud, including setting up a cybercrime hotline, which our digital learning content in Madhya Pradesh promotes. Private sector players like Google have also produced excellent videos to educate women about online safety. We also feel that a two-pronged approach is required to really accelerate women's digital adoption, i.e., not just supporting women to overcome barriers and learn in collectives, but also directly targeting men to change their attitudes. I'm happy to report that BBC Media Action has recently received a grant from the Gates Foundation to explore how we might change men's minds at scale, which would complement our work with women in SHGs. Next slide, please. During our research, early adopters of digital technology in SHGs identified many digital use cases that were important to them. Communication with family, particularly married daughters, was a powerful use case for mothers, as was the view that mobile phones are necessary for women's safety and security. And the ability to save time and effort was a powerful cross-cutting theme. However, the use cases that women told us were the most compelling were to do with economic opportunity. Now I'm going to hand back to Kalpana to talk about how Chaitanya Wise has been creating livelihood opportunities for women in SHGs in Madhya Pradesh, which digital technologies could enhance and accelerate. Over to you, Kalpana.
Thanks. I think the acceptance of digital technology has been growing since COVID times, because that's when a lot of imparting of learning, even meetings happened because face-to-face communication was not there. However, COVID was also a time when a lot of women who were engaged in small businesses were facing enormous challenges in terms of marketing their products. And that's when we realized the importance of use of digital technology for marketing. So one of the things that we started with in 2020 was marketing of products. So we work with women weavers, and they were finding it very difficult to sell their products anywhere because transport was not there, and customers were not available. Usually they would organize exhibitions. That was also not possible. So one of the ways to do was teach them how to take photographs and use WhatsApp business accounts to start sharing it with other customers. So a lot of people in our network were that network was shared with them, and that enabled them to start selling their products. The second most important aspect was building skills using YouTube's, as well as we also have an e-learning digital platform for taking classes on SHG and Federation Management, which is certified by Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So this is for women in rural areas to learn how to upgrade their skills, how to diversify their products. The use of YouTube channel, use of internet has been very useful for women to do that. Uh, the third most important aspect has been increasing the viability of SHG meetings through WhatsApp channels, ensuring greater attendance. If there is a change in meetings, having a WhatsApp group where they can interact with each other and share change in dates, share updates, share photographs to talk about various events that have been happening. It has become a very good tool for women to share best practices with each other. That has been a very important aspect of sharing what's happened in one location with other parts. To give you an example, we work in around 14 districts of Maharashtra and 4 districts of Madhya Pradesh. So, something that is produced in a remote corner of Maharashtra in Nandurbar, which is a tribal belt, can reach out to the semi urban areas of Maharashtra near Bombay just through WhatsApp marketing. This has been possible. The fourth most important aspect has been the e-commerce website and also use of um, uh, financial transactions through mobile apps. So a lot of women have been able to learn how to do financial transactions, which increases transparency. And in fact, very recently we had somebody coming from the US, and he looked at our entire chain of e-commerce work and was happy to state that it could become a transparency brand in future. So this is the kind of transaction that women who are engaged in different enterprises are able to use digital technology for different kinds of marketing, skill enhancement, as well as regularity of meetings. These are the three major components of the use of digital technology. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kalpana. Next slide, please, Matt. We don't have time to go into our theory of change in great detail, but just to summarize what Kalpana has already touched on. So ours is a holistic strategy, not just to address the skills deficit, but the gap in access. We've situated learning in self-help groups to leverage women's trusted social networks and social support outside the home. The SHG federations have recruited relatable role models from the SHGs, i.e. women who already own mobiles and know how to use them, to lead peer learning in groups over time. Building on our experience of empowering frontline health workers, we've equipped these digital champions with digital job aids, which they use to play social and behavior change communication content to women in SHG meetings. The content addresses normative barriers and equips women with arguments to make to gatekeepers at home. The social and behavior change communication content also acts as stimulus for group discussion, demonstration of skills by the digital champions, and opportunities to practice in the meeting. Women are also encouraged to identify digital allies at home or in the community to support their learning. And finally, SHG federations, as Kalpana said, provide interest-free loans for phones to help women overcome the cost barrier. Next step, please. Next slide, please. In the third stage of the project, we worked with Chaitanya Wise and women in SHGs to generate ideas for the intervention. I'm now going to hand over to Arjun Khanna, project manager for the Digital We project, to tell you more. Over to you, Arjun.
Thank you, Sarah. Next slide, please. At the outset, we identified two distinct segments with different needs. The first group included women with lower literacy, few economic resources, and little to no digital skill, who don't own phones and have minimal experience with phone use. We hypothesized that this group was likely to find keypad phones to be more accessible than smartphones and would benefit from content focused on keypad phones and basic digital skills. The second group included women who were relatively better educated, had some degree of shared phone use, and possessed basic digital skills. We hypothesized that individuals in this group would be closer to being able to adopt personal smartphones and thus would benefit from content focused on smartphones and internet related digital skills. Both sets of content aim to provide members of self help groups with relatable, appealing examples of how mobile phones and the internet could be integrated into their lives to enable them to learn new skills, participate in communities, stay connected with families, and improve their livelihood opportunities. These two sets of content, then, were made accessible via two methods. First, the chatbot job aid, which uses the WhatsApp platform. This job aid would deliver the smartphone focused content that I just talked about, allowing digital champions to access video content about various internet related skills. The second method, one that Media Action in India is incredibly familiar with, was the use of an IVR platform, which, in combination with the print leaflet, enabled digital champions to access audio content to play in SHG meetings. This content focused on keypad phones and basic digital skills, and was targeted at the lower literate group that we discussed earlier. While visual content can be a lot more engaging than just audio, IVR remains an important delivery mechanism for areas with poor mobile internet access, and where technical or economic limitations make keypad phones ideal. This has been supported by our system-generated data, which shows near equal consumption of the internet skills content via the chatbot job aid and basic digital skills content via the IVR job aid. It is important to note that the chatbot and IVR service are not simply content delivery mechanisms. Rather, they are intended to be job aids in a broader sense. The chatbot conversation flow and the IVR call flow and leaflet are tailored to support digital champions with the entire interaction, allowing them to lead a structured learning session that continues beyond the content. I will now hand over to Rajat, Associate Project Director for Digital We at BBC Media Action, to talk more about an equally crucial process in the development of the program.
Thanks, Arjun. Next slide, Matt. Thanks. In partnership with Chaitanya Wise, we consciously set out to design an implementation approach for scale and sustainability from the outset, one that piggybacks on the existing structure of self-help group federations without disrupting the existing status quo. As you can see, there are 5 key pillars to our implementation. The SHGs are the most crucial pillar of our implementation strategy. The whole program is executed as part of the regular monthly SHG meetings, which women already attend. In this way, we consciously avoided creating a parallel working structure, which might overburden women given their limited time and mobility issues. Flowing from that, the digital champion is the backbone of the program. She goes to the SHG meeting where she uses the job aids to play digital as social and behavioral change content to women, lead discussions, demonstrate skills, and ensures group practice, including on her own device. Again, we built on an existing model here, i.e. that of a community resource person. CRPs are, as they are known, have been effectively providing training and services to women in SHG Federation since the 1980s. In terms of training, we adopted a very light touch approach of training of trainers approach, which is typically used to train frontline workers at scale. However, we quickly learned that the training provided by master trainers to newly recruited digital champions was not standardized and of variable quality. We had anticipated this based on our experience of rolling out large-scale mobile health job aids to frontline workers before, which is why we created a training video to reduce this reliance on face-to-face training. The training video shows newly recruited digital champions how to use the digital job aid to take SHG members through a structured learning session in the meetings. The training video can be shared via WhatsApp and is accessible through the chatbot itself. For the incentive mechanism for digital champions, we developed this in partnership with Chaitanya Vice and the federations, benchmarking it against their standard payment approach and rate for community resource people who are paid on a per meeting basis. And finally, we work with Chaitanya Vice and the federations to embed the program in their existing monitoring and supervision process. Anushka Ibrahim from Chaitanya Vice is going to talk more about this later in today's presentation. Next slide, Matt. Thanks. During the last year, we have learned that there are certain characteristics which make for a very successful digital champion. She is usually younger, which automatically often corresponds to confident communication skills and a comfort with a mobile phone. Another key characteristic we've noticed is her mobility and ability to travel to meetings. Next slide. In step 4, we created prototypes starting with the social and behavior change communication content, which was collaboratively developed with our creative and production partner, Kaboom. In terms of our creative and production process for this proof of concept, we also followed an iterative approach where we created outputs in small packets first, which were then cognitively tested with the respondents from the target population and were repeatedly modified in small batches. Next slide. Our brand, Phone To Uthao, is creatively designed to highlight the central call to action, i.e., just pick up the phone. Phone To Uthao is thought out as not just a sentence, but something that invokes an urge to try something new. Additionally, we also cleverly use the phrase Phone To Uthao within our scripts to maximize recall of the brand. The brand logo, as you can see on your screens, uses a pictorial representation of the name with the added dimension of relatable elements like women's bangles. Next slide. Khushi, which means happiness in Hindi, is our central persona and narrative for the chatbot videos. It is a very common name among younger women in Madhya Pradesh, and Didi is a respectable word for sister, hence Khushi Didi. Khushi is 30 years old. She's an SHG leader and a digital champion. She's aspirational yet relatable, whose vocabulary and tonality are very similar to that found in peri-urban Madhya Pradesh. She is recently skilled smartphone user and someone who is not afraid to fail or seek support, making her inspirational yet very relatable to the women. She is someone who is lively, animated, and visibly excited in her speech, something that you will shortly see in one of our video clips. Next slide.
इस महीने तो सबकी पूरी हाजिरी है और हो भी क्यों ना, अब मैं समूह की अध्यक्ष बन गई हूँ। कल पिंकी ने कहा, दीदी आजकल समूह में बहुत मजा आता है, आपसे इतनी सारी चीजें सीखने को जो मिलती हैं। हमारे गुरु तो आप हैं, पर आपके गुरु कौन है? तो मैंने अपना फोन निकाला और ये लाल तिकोना बटन दिखाया। ये है मेरे गुरु, गुरु यूट्यूब। ये फोन ना बड़े काम की चीज है, इसी पर तो मैं YouTube से नई नई चीजें सीखती हूँ। विश्वास नहीं होता तो ये देखो।
Sorry, I was just on mute for a second there. Right, like I was saying, this is just a short clip from one of the many videos that are accessible to digital champions via the WhatsApp job aid. I'm going to hand over back to Arjun now to tell you more about the job aids. Thank you.
Thanks, Rajat. The brand, the content, and the technology then all come together to form the job aids. On screen right now are some visuals of the WhatsApp chatbot job aid that provide a small look at what the digital champion would see while conducting SHG meetings. The chatbot conversation flow begins with a short introduction, followed by a section that collects informed consent for data collection from first-time users, and subsequently a video selection menu. Each video, when selected, leads to a conversation that is structured into 4 parts. The first part provides a brief introduction to the topic of the video and includes the video file itself. After showing the video to members in the group, the digital champion then follows a series of button presses which guide her through individual prompts for discussion, a skill for her to demonstrate to group members, and finally, a skill for group members to practice themselves, usually on the digital champion's phone. As important as the SBCC content is itself, we recognize that group discussion, peer learning and demonstrations, and the opportunity for hands-on learning are equally crucial to the process of digital adoption. I will now hand back to Sarah to introduce the fifth step of the human-centered design process.
Thanks, Arjun. In step 5 of the process, as the SHG federations began rolling out the intervention, including the WhatsApp chatbot, we began to iteratively test all aspects of it with digital champions and women in SHGs and their husbands, including pre-testing all the chatbot video content, the IVR audio content, and usability testing the UX and UI. I'm going to hand over now to Verinder Gambhir, BBC Media Action in India's research director, to tell you more about our research study design. Over to you, Verinder.
Thanks, Sarah. So can we just move to the next slide, please, Matt? Thank you. I'll be talking about the testing and the rigorous iterative research design that we followed to test the content that you just saw, the prototypes that you just saw that was shown by Arjun and Rajat. Next slide, please, Matt. What you see on this slide is the rigorous design. Like I said, it was iterative. We went to the field, I think, 3 times. We were, measuring. We were at the same time testing the content, the job aids, having several interactions and cognitively testing it with the change agents, which is the mobile sakhis, the digital champions, as well as with the primary audiences, which is, the women in self-help groups who did not own mobile phones. We also tested the content with their husbands, like Kalpana and Sarah both mentioned that it was very important to not just, address the mindsets and efficacy of the women, but also the gender norms as well as the enabling environment. So we tested the content also for acceptability within, the gatekeepers of the women. And research was essentially a mix of, what you see on the slide, 2 rounds of content pre-testing as well as 2 rounds of user testing of the job aids with the mobile sakhis, as well as observations of the actual group meetings in action. So these were really the unassisted fly-on-the-wall observations of women's group meetings that helped us understand what the challenges on the ground really are. How is it that our job aids are being used? How is it that the content is being seen, with that group of women in the self-help groups? So this really helped us identify also the training needs of the mobile sakhis to address these through a training video that we finally, also came up with. Research also included process evaluation across various levels of stakeholders, as well as qualitative assessment and a small quant dipstick, which the team incidentally just wrapped up in Maheshwan and Ujjain. We were, additionally also continuously assessing our system-generated data to understand the attendance and the frequency of the meetings. Overall, in the end, we ended up doing 241 in-depth interviews only to test the content and the job aid usability. In addition to that, we did 75 in-depth interviews and a short dipstick to assess the effectiveness of the project. All the research activities, I just want to make a mention here, were strictly complied with BBC Media Action's safeguarding protocols and research ethics. We also, followed the Independent Institutional Review Board, took a certificate. There was informed consent from all the participants, and that is why we're able to, share all the data here today in the webinar. Next slide, please, Matt. Thank you. This is a lovely picture of the team in the field for the gender intentional research. Next slide, please. So without getting into too many details, what I'll do in the subsequent couple of slides is to show you a few examples from our content pretest to basically show what went behind the scenes and how did we come up with the final SBCC content that we thought would work. The content that Rajat Arjun shared with you in the initial slides. I'll just take you through a little bit of behind the scenes on that, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. What you see here is the evolving persona of Khushi Didi. Post the first pretest, some respondents told us that Khushi Didi looked like she was from Mumbai or Delhi, that she spoke a very bazari Hindi, which basically meant Hindi that they understood, but it seemed upmarket. Women told us that she was a madam that they would look up to. Critically, what was most important for us from the pretest findings that came out was that her relationship with the self-help group wasn't coming across as clearly and evidently as we would have liked. She was liked and she was aspirational, but she was not one of them. So we changed few things about Khushi. We removed her makeup, we dressed her in a less expensive sari, we simplified her Hindi vocabulary, and we reduced the speed of her delivery and the use of her metaphors. We also rewrote scripts to emphasize her role as a SAG leader. In addition to these, so this is what you see on the screen, with respect to Khushi Didi in the video content. In addition to these, we also added a new character, which was Kamda Didi, to the mix. While earlier there was one Didi, Khushi Didi, for both video and audio content, but to keep it easy for the mobile sakhis to distinguish between the two job aids, we brought in Kamla Didi, who is a farmer and a secretary of her federation, and she basically taught about the keypad phones to the women. Next slide, please. Thanks, Matt. This slide is, one of our 100-odd slides on the learnings from the video outputs. What I want to focus on really is that every piece of our content was pre-tested for appeal, for comprehension, for relevance, credibility, as well as new information for our audiences. We also tested the content for acceptability, like I said, within the gatekeepers. That is the husbands, as well as, the mobile sakhis who are teaching these women in the groups. What you see on the slide in particular is that our narrative around how phone can help women like the self-help group women was particularly liked in how it helps these samu meetings, how it can help organizing the samu meetings, how it can help with train timings or inquiring from school teachers about their kids exams. So it was all very relevant use cases, which were based on evidence, based on our formative research, and finally, tested very, very rigorously, because of which, we can finally say that, this content is working in the field. The sari business, that use case was the one that resonated the most with the women as well as their husbands. Next slide, please. Thank you. A very similar analysis was also done on the audio content to check the relatability of the content within the women who might opt for a keypad phone and not a smartphone. So the use case on, struggle to find contractual work within the daily wage laborers without a phone, this was the one that especially resonated with the women. Majority of the women told us that they really liked the bit in the video where the daughter-in-law was shown teaching to the mother-in-law. This actually spoke directly to one of the barriers that we heard Sarah also mention earlier in the slides, that women mainly say that we don't know how to use a mobile phone. So when we actually showed in our content on how this can be done through through the family or through the samu meetings, that really resonated with the women. It gave them hope, that they can learn phone as well, and they don't really need to buy a phone or learn initially and then buy a phone. It can happen in parallel. Now, before I hand over to Anjora, who will be taking us through the UX test learning and the digital vocabulary, and has been working with us for over a year on the project, I want to quickly mention a few names from the research team who've been working tirelessly on this behind the scenes, which is Nidhi Sen, Nandini Banerjee, and Nima Gupta. With that, over to you, Anjora, for the next bit. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Virender, and good evening, everyone. Can we go to the next slide, please, Matt? And the next slide. Thanks. So we know that digital terminology, much like digital technology, has been rapidly evolving around the world for the last couple of decades, including in non-English speaking low and middle income countries. The speed of this evolution makes it difficult for those situated in contexts with limited digital access to adopt English digital terminology. Research from public health communication shows us how important it is to use terminology which is appropriate and localized to communities. Similarly, in the context of gender based violence, Fricker, in her book Epistemic Injustice, has talked about how the absence of a proper understanding and terminology to label shared experiences can prevent women from taking measures to address, stop, or act upon them. Next slide, please. So, there are many risks of not identifying accessible and vernacular digital terminology that the target population can understand. Some of these are that the content designed to support women's digital learning will not be understood by the intended beneficiaries, that low literate, low income women will not be able to navigate and use digital solutions designed for them, and that quantitative surveys will capture inaccurate data on women's level of digital access, ownership, skill, and use. Next slide, please. Over the last year, we have created a vernacular dictionary of digital terms, which informed the design of our digital learning content and job aid interfaces that you've seen before. Our aim was to learn the vernacular vocabulary that is already being used in rural India to describe digital skills and platforms so as to empower women with little digital knowledge and access with vocabulary to discuss the digital world, and also to identify metrics for measuring digital access, ownership, skill, use, and literacy. The vernacular dictionary at present consists of more than 80 digital concepts and terms and is intended to be a dynamic working document enriched by contributions from research work in different parts of the country. So, how is this done? There is research to support that digital solutions have a higher likelihood for success if the end users are part of the design process. This is why, as Sarah has mentioned before, we have used a gender intentional, human centric approach which accounts for individual characteristics, needs, and challenges. We've also conducted extensive cognitive interviews and usability testing with early digital adopters and male owners of top up shops, that is, recharge shops in Madhya Pradesh. Next slide, please. During our work in the field, we found there to be many conceptual disconnects with regard to digital terms that those of us designing interventions might be taking for granted, especially, for example, when translating survey questions into vernacular languages. The concept of ownership of a phone, for instance, varies widely in low literate, low income contexts. It may refer to, firstly, as collective ownership, that is, where someone who is not the primary user or possessor of the device may still consider themselves as owning it at the family level, just the way a family collectively owns a car or a refrigerator. Then there's facilitated ownership, where the actual owner of the device does not have any or maybe limited digital skills and cannot use the device without the assistance of other family members. Then there's something which is non functional ownership, where someone may report themselves as owning a phone even if it does not have a SIM or the phone does not work. There are similar problems when talking about digital use or skills. For example, a respondent may report that they use YouTube every day without actually having the ability to navigate a smartphone or YouTube by themselves. Being shown YouTube videos by a family member on their phone may be reported as using YouTube, which may be leading to over-reporting of digital skills by these communities. For example, in the graphic on the right, you can see that there's a 273 million difference in the number of internet users in India as reported by CIA World Factbook versus the Internet World Stats. Next slide, please. So, contextualizing language around digital technology is not as simple as just replacing words. Rather, it requires a nuanced understanding of how concepts are interpreted and articulated in different contexts. Net, for example, is a term that is primarily used for the internet in communities where we were working. However, the terms internet and net, when speaking in Hindi in low income contexts, do not carry the association with a network of devices or agents the way they do in English. Therefore, graphics that depict networks to explain the internet in learning materials aren't understood by the communities. There are also differences in how verbs operate upon terms. While in English we may say on the net, in Hindi and low income contexts we say took from the net. This difference in language may seem minor, but when we tested these phrases with women in SHGs, they were confused by the use of the word on to describe searching for information on the internet, which reduced their comprehension. Sometimes terms may carry multiple meanings which may not be used in standard English. So when net is the term used to refer to the internet, the term is also used to refer to data and balance in low income contexts. that is, as something which has a measurable, depletable quantity. Next slide, please. So, when communicating with non English speakers who have low familiarity with digital technologies, phrases or descriptions of terms can often be more effective than their direct vernacular translations, is what we found. While the term voice message can be intuitive to English speakers, including those with low familiarity with digital terminology, the intuitive connection between the terms voice and message is lost when communicating with non English speakers. Instead, we found that the most effective way to communicate WhatsApp voice message to be to use a descriptive phrase, that is, messages that you can send by speaking through WhatsApp. Similarly, the concept of text to speech is most effectively communicated by saying writing or typing by speaking, instead of a direct translation of the term. Therefore, it's critical to identify vernacular digital terminology that is understood and used by communities. This can inform the design of accessible and engaging digital solutions, particularly for women. With that, I'm now passing it back to Arjun, who will talk about learnings from designing accessible WhatsApp chatbots for women in low literate, low income contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjura. Next slide, please, Matt. And one more. Thank you. Through the iterative human-centered design process and over 6 months of testing, we learned many things which were subsequently incorporated into the job aids design. Communicating through text, which was one of the main mediums of the chatbot, is obviously incredibly different from communicating through audio or verbally, particularly in low literate contexts, where it creates additional complexity with communication. Additionally, as Anjora just covered, language can be very messy, and getting it right is crucial for effective communication. These concerns with language are best addressed through multiple means, including, but certainly not limited to, cognitive testing of terms with beneficiaries, using very limited, accessible vocabulary, but also at a creative level, working with scriptwriters who really understand the specific lexicon and audience. Our fourth learning, of course, is the most ideal. The best way to limit the complications that come with textual communication is to enhance or replace it with visual communication. Another couple interesting of learnings were that users in low literacy contexts particularly struggled with certain punctuation or grammatical tools. Colons, bullet lists, or similar tools, which we had originally included to help simplify things, turned out to do quite the opposite. Finally, while emojis can be a really simple way to introduce visuals and a bit of character to text messages, we found that people in our context possessed a very limited emoji vocabulary, for lack of a better term. Basic emojis such as smileys and hearts are no problem, but the more complex ones can fail to be recognized. Next slide, please, Matt. Thank you. On the more UI related side of things, we did many experiments. There is really no way to overstate the importance of task based usability testing in the design of digital interventions. Reports from users and our interpretations of them will always come with a degree of positive bias. But task based user testing enables you to put the questions of accessibility and navigability front and center. Other learnings included prioritizing linear flows or experiences. When we interact with digital systems, we often build mental maps of how they work. And the simpler this map can be, the better it is for ease of use. While we originally developed the chatbot to use text inputs as a means of navigation, such as responding with a 1 or a 0, we soon found problems with this approach. We were originally concerned that less digitally savvy users who have never encountered interactive elements on WhatsApp may find them confusing. However, over iterations, we discovered that interactive elements were indeed the better approach to use. Text input based navigation is complex. Users need to first identify the correct response option, then locate it on their keyboard, often requiring an additional step of switching keyboard layers, and then send it in. That's a lot of steps. Interactive elements like buttons, however, really narrow down the user's options. All it requires, literally, is the press of a button. The last learning that I will cover is one that I think we are all personally familiar with. That is the tendency to skip the wall of text, so to say. When users are confronted with dense, long messages with a lot of text, they are unlikely to read them in their entirety. Everyone is familiar with times when skimming a long paragraph is simpler than reading it in detail. And this behavior doesn't only apply to single messages, it also applies to groups of multiple messages. Often, when a group of multiple messages was delivered, users would ignore the first few messages and only focused on the most recent. This problem is aggravated when users are required to scroll. Luckily, this problem is addressed by another design recommendation of ours, the use of what WhatsApp calls highly structured messages. These are composite messages, that is, messages that integrate multiple forms of media, including text, audio, still images, or videos. These allow designers to create a much more vibrant and engaging experience with the user, limiting the risk of certain messages being skipped altogether. Next slide, please, Matt. Thank you. While we need to acknowledge that there is still a lot of work to be done towards the creation of accessible, actually intelligible digital privacy policies and informed consent processes for women in low literate, low income contexts, we do hope that our experience can contribute to future work focused on the same. Over the course of the Phone to Tell program, we went through multiple iterations of our informed consent process. Our starting point was a standard BBC English language privacy policy with all the requirements for legal compliance, which was then translated into Hindi with a critical lens. Our first attempt using this text resulted in close to no comprehension by respondents. This was due to both vocabulary and conceptual gaps. Other than the complexity that legal language often comes with, we had a much larger core problem to address. How do you talk about privacy, informed consent, and personal data with an audience that has never engaged with these concepts? How do you request informed consent from respondents who are unfamiliar with the idea of personal data? One of our solutions was to break down the language of personal data into individual data points that we would be collecting. Permission to collect your data then was replaced by permission to save your phone number, send you messages on WhatsApp, and track how you use the Phone to House service. The last point, however, about tracking usage was one that proved to be exceptionally difficult to explain, particularly given the very low familiarity that intended users have with digital technology and processes. The absence of a strong discourse around data protection and privacy in Hindi and other regional languages also means that respondents were often confused. Why are you asking for permission at all? Some would ask. Our approach across iterations was to focus on some core principles, simplifying language, including what I would call legalese, into accessible vernacular language, along with the digital terminology that Njora has previously covered. Improving accessibility, which we did through an audio based privacy policy for users with low literacy. And lastly, but critically, questioning all the concepts that we often take for granted in conversations with one another, whether they be digital concepts such as usage tracking or legal ones like personal data or data controller. Over the course of 6 months, numerous tests, and countless revisions, we have ultimately arrived at a point that is closer to our goal of an accessible, informed consent process. But as I said at the start, there is still a lot of work for all of us to do in the future. I will now hand over to Anushka Abraham from Chaitanya Wise to cover early emerging results from the program.
Yes. Thank you, Arjun. Addressing the question of how the Federation ensured effective supervision and monitoring of every meeting which the DCs participated in on a monthly basis, we developed a three-step reporting process for all DCs where at the first level, immediately after sharing the monthly videos and learnings, okay, I think, Matt, can you change to the next slide? And the next one. Yes. As you can see, at the first level, immediately after sharing the monthly videos and learnings in the SSG meeting, the DC was responsible to record the same in writing on the meeting minutes, as you can see, registered, of the SSG, which is maintained at the SSG level and signed by all meeting participants. Then the photos of these meetings and minutes were then correspondingly shared by them in the common WhatsApp group they are a part of. Once all SSG meetings in that village is conducted, the office bearers of every SSG gathers at the cluster or the village organization level where all financial transactions take place officially. This is where the second level of reporting happens, where all DCs report to the office bearers in their village regarding the meetings they've conducted in that village in that month. At the next level, the third and final level, the reporting happens at the Federation office, at the Federation meeting, where office bearers, who are women leaders from every village, who meet in the Federation office along with the management team on a fixed day every month, once all SG meetings for that month are over. Here, the DC reports, the digital champion, reports to the Federation office bearers and staff through a monthly reporting format as well as discussions. The discussions being the most interesting part of the monthly meeting, where they troubleshoot all difficulties faced in meetings, share all concerns and learnings from their meetings, and help and support each other through the shared new experience. Um, all data collected through these multiple channels of reporting are then cross verified by the Federation staff with the system generated data shared by BBCMA to then generate the monthly payment reports. Next slide, please. 69% of digital champions participated at the federation level reporting every month across both locations. This is a participation rate which almost matches with the office bearers who participate in this monthly meeting, which was really encouraging to observe. And roughly half of them self reported that more members are now attending meetings, the duration of SSG meetings has increased, women are learning basic and advanced phone skills, and some women were also applying for loans for phones from the self-help group corpus as well as the federation corpus, and alongside acquiring phones from their family members. Finally, a really inspiring change which emerged from this project, as I could observe, was increased leadership skills, which is very evident in all DDs who participated in this project. It gave them an opportunity to step out and interact with many women while improving their social skills, level of confidence, as well as digital skills. And it is important to keep in mind that all of this data was self reported by digital champions. In addition to this, BBC Media Action also conducted a quantitative dipstick survey with the self help group members who were exposed to the Phone to Tao project content to explore early impact of the program after just 4 months of implementation. I'll now hand off to Varinder Gambhir, India Research Director at BBC Media Action, to share a case study from the recent research. Thank you.
Thanks, Anushka. So, last slide, please, Matt, before we get into the fireside chat. Thank you. We just wanted to first, just to quickly clarify, we've done our own dipstick and study, and the results of that, like I said, it just finished, will be available by end of December. Anushka just reported the self-reported data from the mobile Sakhis, which is very encouraging, but it will take time for women to, of course, latch onto the loans and buying phones. So we're really hoping that we can see those distilled outcomes in some time as well. So very quickly on the case study that we wanted to show you today, about just to bring to life the role that Phone to Tao has played in the lives of the women. This is, a 25-year-old woman, mother of 3 boys in Tajpur village, which is near Ujjain city. And, the family is in debt, paying loan installments for their house. She told us that she's worried that they might not be able to repay the loan with her husband's wages. She wants to educate her 3 sons and earn more for the family, but doesn't know how. She's been engaged with the SSG for over a year and has also attended 3 Phone to Tao meetings. Before Phone to Tao, she could only answer and disconnect calls on her husband's phone. Now she can dial numbers and search for contacts, and she has asked the mobile Sakhi to teach her how to access YouTube because she wants to learn stitching and tailoring. So she also told us that she's already asked her husband for a mobile phone. The husband wants to buy her a keypad phone, but she feels that it should be a smartphone because that's the only way she can watch the YouTube videos and add to the family's income as well. We just really hope that this efficacy and intent that we've seen so far can convert into actual adoption of phones. And with that, I would now like to pass the baton to Ankur, who is the country director for India and BBC Media Action, for the fireside chat. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Varinder. I will introduce 2 of my panelists for this chat today. The first is Claire Sipthorpe, who's the head of Connected Women and Connected Society Initiative at GSMA. And second, Sarah Chamberlain, my colleague at BBC Media Action, our director for digital at the India office. So welcome, Claire and Sarah. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that wonderful presentation, and to everybody else from Pradhan and GSMA and BBC Media Action. Claire, my first question is to you. It would be great to hear your reaction to the presentation that we just saw, given all the work that GSMA Connected Women Initiative has done in South Asia over the years.
Great, thanks, and thanks so much for the presentations. It was super interesting, really also resonates with what we've been seeing in our research and work in India. I think
our research, I think, highlights very similar things, that women and men tend to experience the same high-level barriers to internet adoption, things that you guys have mentioned, affordability, particularly handsets, lack of knowledge and skills, and and many of the challenges that have been mentioned here. But the reality is that women tend to experience these challenges more acutely because of the social norms that have been discussed quite extensively in this session, and some of the structural inequalities around sort of disparities between men and women in terms of education income. So I think it's really good that that you've really highlighted the importance of social norms, and that we've been hearing that. They're very, we try to measure these issues, and social norms are very hard to measure, but we have analyzed our data that we have in India, and it shows that even with women of the same levels of income, education, literacy, employment as men, there would still be a mobile gender gap. So I think this shows just the importance of issues that are harder to measure, such as discrimination, social norms are at play. And I think, many of the presenters here have talked about some of them. I think as Sarah highlighted in one of the earlier slides about our report on triggering mobile internet, women face more challenges adopting mobile internet than men, mainly due to these social norms. Women is, again, in our research, very similar to what we are finding. Women are denied by gatekeepers, or it may seem less relevant or attainable, because women are seen as vulnerable to threats because of the negative side of the web. They might have less sort of purchasing power to be able to buy a phone. They also have, lead busy lives with little free time to learn or use technology, often have smaller social circles and less confidence in learning digital skills. So I think, what I was hearing today really much resonates with what we've done with our findings. And I think the kind of the focus that was mentioned here around finding relatable examples, acceptable use cases, leveraging trusted social networks like the women's self-help groups, and unpicking really the needs and the conceptual understanding. I found it fascinating to hear about the different terminology and use of vernacular words. And doing it through a human design-centered process. I think all these things that you guys have been talking about is really important. And I think one of the things that we see is that there's a real lack of understanding of these issues. And I think research like what you guys have been doing is just really, really important in terms of filling this gap. So yeah, I think it's been fascinating and does really resonate with what we've been seeing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. You've talked a lot about social norms, and that covered a large part of our presentation today in terms of where the structural barriers to both accessing and owning mobile phones, as well as using mobile internet in some settings for women are. I'll start with you, Sarah, now for my next question. In that context of where social norms and structural barriers prevent access and mobile phone use, as well as use of mobile internet, among women who have managed to become digitally literate, what do you think has played the biggest role in enabling this?
Interesting question, Ankur. So we've observed some very clear trends. Women who own phones and are using them for purposes that they consider meaningful either have supportive families, particularly husbands and mother-in-laws, who support, for example, their involvement in the SHG, their mobility outside the home, their continued education, or being paid for work. Or conversely, they live in a situation where the grip of patriarchy, dare I say, has weakened, i.e., where a husband is ill or unable to work, he's unemployed, or she's a widow, or she's left her husband and is responsible for supporting the family herself. So in these circumstances, we find women purchasing and learning how to use phones for lots of economic purposes, to find work more easily, to better manage relationships with employers, to build their own businesses. And I think what this really illustrates is that the sort of foundational need here is this sort of social support. And the digital champions, who we've heard so much about today, invariably those women have social support in the home. So, so they have husbands, mother-in-laws, father-in-laws, and other family members who say, yes, this is a really good thing. You need to go out, get out there. This would be good for you. use your phone for these purposes and have helped them acquire phones in the first place. So underneath the economic use cases and the economic opportunity, there's still this sort of foundational need for social support. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. If I can just ask a follow-up. So, Sarah, are you still there? I think Sarah has dropped out. Claire, do you want to add anything to what Sarah has said?
I think Sarah's back if you want to ask her your
Sorry.
follow-up. Otherwise, I'm happy to respond. Yeah.
I'll go to her after you. So please go ahead if you want to add anything to what Sarah has just said.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Sarah says, and I think what we're seeing also is that for women to adopt mobile internet, it needs to be both personally appealing to women and externally justifiable to their families. So, so what we see as, you have to persuade some of those gatekeepers to allow women to access mobile internet, and that it will benefit the household. So I think the kind of examples that we're seeing where that sort of plays out, video calling, especially to be, call family who might live far away or overseas. They can't see in person. It's less expensive, is a justifiable case. Learning a new product, learning a new skill, such, that they need for cooking or something that's acceptable. Also helping children with education. We saw during COVID that a lot of women started to use mobile internet during lockdowns and it was a huge spike in increase because, needing to get online to educate their children, anything that sort of benefits the households. And we're seeing that women are also using where it can save time or make money is again another case where there's strong arguments to use. So I think having that sort of social network, but also having those sort of justifiable use cases is really important for driving. And I think, in terms of how can we complement or supplement these skills programs to help reach women, I think having awareness campaigns to really show how mobile and internet access can benefit, making sure women are part of those campaigns, making sure that, that women can see others in their social circles. So I think the fact that, again, BBC Media Action's, getting people that women know and that they trust to kind of show them and demonstrate the use is really important. I think it's something that involves all sort of stakeholders to kind of get involved. So sort of building a little bit on, I agree with Sarah, but sort of adding that extra bit. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Sarah, coming back to you. Given that a lot of this use and access is going to, as we've seen, move where there is social support, do you want to talk a little bit about the work that we are going to do as BBC Media Action on men and why that's important given all of the work that we've done on this project and what we've learned?
Sure. As I think I mentioned a little earlier on in the presentation, as part of our digital literacy landscaping study, we looked at which digital literacy interventions, not just in India, but in South Asia and also really around the world, had shown the most promise, had achieved the best results. And we did a lot of key informant interviews with really, I'd say, sort of thought leaders and people working in this space, including donors, investors. And what we found is that interventions, programs that both did what we're doing right now to engage women in supportive environments and supporting them in overcoming these barriers, and working with them to equip them with arguments that they could make to gatekeepers at home, really needs to be complemented by a concerted effort to change men's attitudes. And this is something actually that we've been talking about for a long time. And while we're here with the GSMA and hopefully some mobile network operators are on the presentation, attending the presentation today, I'd just like to say a word about industry advertising. Because I think one of the relatively easy things it could be done that could be a real game changer is if mobile device advertising, internet advertising shifted away from a focus on really young males and entertainment use cases So people going on holiday and taking lots of selfies and having fun, and nightclubs where women are often sort of sidekicks. Maybe there could be a shift to where women are shown in more empowered roles, where they're actually using technology for purposes that are really meaningful in their life, right? And in society. So I'm talking about, women who are using mobile phones as part of their work, as part of their livelihoods, as to participate in the political space, to be leaders. So really showing women in more empowered ways. And I think that kind of advertising, which is so pervasive and influential, could perhaps help shift men's attitudes towards their wives and their daughters and their sisters using smartphones and the mobile internet. Because at the moment, there really is a very negative attitude towards women's use of social media and the internet. It is not really considered respectable for women. And so I think changing men's attitudes is crucial. And, we can't just address women. We really need to directly target men, young men, in the places where they are, where we can reach them. For example, on social media. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of men, young men particularly, on social media in urban, peri-urban, and even rural India. And we really need to make a concerted effort to change the way they see women's control of information communications technology. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And that's fundamental to what we are hoping to do with the next phase in terms of looking at gender norms and looking at barriers with male gatekeepers, etc. Okay, back to Claire. How do you think digital technology can accelerate women's economic empowerment, and why?
Big question. Yeah. So, I think we, our research, we ask these questions, does it benefit you? How is it using? And we see that, that they, the huge value in being feeling more connected, sort of more autonomous, safer. It's sort of, I agree with Sarah that there's a perception that going on online is not safe potentially. I think there's lots we can do. I think digital skills training, people giving the skills to keep themselves safe online is part of that. But also when we ask people about the benefits of the internet, one of the top ones that comes out is actually going online. They feel having that access to mobile and connectivity makes them feel safer. So it's a bit of a paradoxical thing, but I think that in terms of empowerment is important. And we see that, again, in our research, that it's providing women with opportunities and information that they've never had access to before, and often had access to the first time, the only way they can access it. So I think it's really empowering. And I think, from an economic perspective, if you asked, I think it can help women find a job, income generation opportunities, manage their finances. And I think there's a huge potential. And so, in fact, sort of, you've mentioned your next stage on your project, but we are actually just launched a project where we're looking at women micro entrepreneurs in India and other countries, but including India, and the kind of how they're using mobiles for their business, what are the barriers they face, and what are the opportunities to better support them, because we see this as a real opportunity. And I think there's just not enough data on this as well. So we're trying to fill that data gap. So hopefully we'll be publishing in the next year. And so watch this space, and hopefully we'll have more to say on this topic.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah and Claire. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So I'll hand over back to Isabel.
Thank you very much, Ankur Garg, and thank you, Claire Sibthorpe and Sarah Chamberlain, for your insights there. We are at the end of our session. So just thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you to all the different speakers for sharing your insights. And I think it's really put on the table the importance of using the right terminology, particularly when working with women of low literacy, the importance of user testing, and the human touch points that are needed alongside technology solutions, particularly in settings where women have not had the opportunities to use mobile so comfortably before, and where social norms can constrain their use or their self-image that they've taken on. I think, Sarah, how you put that at the beginning about absorbing those messages. So the importance of having those human touch points and multiple touch points along the way to build women's confidence and use of mobile and in order to be able to access mobile internet. And finally, just to say that we do need a comprehensive approach to tackling all the barriers that women face to accessing mobile and accessing the mobile internet. And to do so, we need many actors working together to do this. So thank you very much for listening. Please do check the links in the chat for all the different reports, and we look forward to sharing more insights with you in future. Have a great day.
Thank you.